Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are. It's my pleasure to welcome you all and moderate this webinar for the launch of Education International's new research behind the platforms, safeguarding intellectual property rights and academic freedom in higher education. My name is Sonia Grix. I coordinate the work of the Secretariat of Education International in Higher Education and Research. As many of you will know, Education International is the global union federation representing more than 32 million teachers and education support personnel and researchers working in all levels of education, from early childhood to higher education and research. I'm pleased to be joined today by Haldis Holst, our Deputy General Secretary, who will deliver some opening remarks, and Janja Komljenovic, who co-authored this study and will present key findings from the research. So with this, I think we're ready to start, and I would like to turn to you, Haldis, for some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and hello to everyone, wherever you are around the world and whatever part of the day it is. I'm delighted to open this that I consider very important webinar on a very important topic and share a few thoughts with you as we launch the new research Sonia referred to, exploring the impact of edtech platforms on academic freedom and intellectual property rights of academic staff. Allow me to start by thanking already partially introduced Janja Komljenovic, who is with us today, and her colleague, Ben Williamson, who co-authored this research, for the important work that they have undertaken on this project. Through our research and advocacy work over the past years, Education International has warned against an increase in trends of marketization, privatization, and commercialization in education systems around the world. This led us to launch our global campaign, Go Public Fund Education, and I think you can see it as a background of very many people on this webinar. These trends were accelerated through the COVID-19 pandemic with the rapid growth in the use of educational technology services. Higher education has been particularly hard hit by these trends, and digitalization has been rampant in the sector. The fast introduction of educational technologies brought several benefits, but also serious challenges to teachers, researchers, and workers in academia. During the pandemic, for example, higher education teachers and researchers were increasingly concerned about higher education institutions claiming ownership of teaching materials produced by their employed teaching staff. This was because of clauses included in the terms of service and licensing agreements that govern the use of some platforms, limiting or assigning intellectual property rights related to the content created or shared through the platforms. Similarly, edtech byproducts such as data analytics, artificial intelligence, and predictive technologies have jeopardized academic freedom and the rights of higher education personnel to make professionally informed judgments and decisions. The research that we launched today provides us with in-depth understanding of the new challenges that edtech platforms introduce in terms of academic freedom and intellectual property. Two fundamental aspects of the academic work enshrined in the 1997 UNESCO recommendation concerning the status of higher education teaching personnel. Education International is committed to safeguarding academic freedom as a fundamental professional right of higher education teaching personnel and researchers. Academic freedom is critical for advancing and disseminating knowledge, fostering independent thinking and expression, strengthening democracy, and contributing to the common good of societies. At Education International, we firmly believe that the public good is best served by the widest and most accessible dissemination of knowledge. At the same time, we are witnessing widening patterns of inequality in accessing and creating research. This is why we have been advocating for a balanced approach to global intellectual property rights and copyright reforms that empower teachers as both creators and users. Our discussions today are particularly timely. In September, the joint ILO-UNESCO Committee of Experts on the application of the recommendations concerning teachers' personnel will meet, as including the 1997 one. The Committee of Experts is in charge of promoting and monitoring the implementation of the recommendation. In addition, the recommendations of the United Nations High-Level Panel on the Teaching Profession are nothing short of a breakthrough. Drawing on expertise from ministries of education and labor, employers' organizations, teachers' unions, and others, the panel set out a clear plan of action to, quote, to transform the teaching profession into a high status, highly qualified, well supported, properly remunerated, and highly respected profession, which is capable of guiding and promoting inclusive, effective, and relevant learning. Wow. The president of Education International, Susan Hopgood, was the voice of the profession on the panel. The panel's 59 recommendations apply to all levels of education, including tertiary education. The recommendations represent a turning point in global education policy making. Recognizing that investing in well-qualified and well-supported teachers is an investment in the quality and sustainability of our education systems, the recommendations reiterate and reinforce many of the provisions of the 1997 recommendation, while also covering new ground. For example, the recommendations promote teachers' mental health and holistic well-being and advance human-centered education technology. If you haven't read the recommendations, I recommend you do. Because through its recommendations, the panel recognizes and reaffirms the enabling rights necessary to facilitate the transformation of the teaching profession, including freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and academic freedom. The recommendations stress that, quote again, teachers need autonomy and pedagogical choice in how they use technology to ensure that a given technology improves learning, and call for safeguarding teachers' professional autonomy, pedagogical expertise, and ability to make pedagogical choices. We are confident that this new EI research will help unions and activists deepen their understanding of how edtech platforms affect the rights of teachers and researchers worldwide and how they can take action, including by leveraging the high-level panel recommendations. Because this broad and progressive set of recommendations provides a unique opportunity to affect real change. Education International remains committed to the collective action, advocacy, and mobilization necessary to make the recommendations a reality for all teachers, education support personnel, and students around the world. These must not be recommendations that are stuffed away in a cupboard or a drawer. So I thank you for joining us. I look forward to following the event and to all the work you'll do afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Haldis, for these opening remarks and for framing these important issues also in the context of the United Nations high-level panel on the teaching profession. I can see that many colleagues are starting introducing themselves in the chat. We have colleagues joining from different parts of the world. I think almost all regions of EI are covered, colleagues from Mexico, South Africa, France, Malaysia. It's great. So continue introducing yourself in the chat. And as I said earlier, do not hesitate to share your comments, reflections, experiences there, and we will pick them up. It's now my pleasure to introduce Janja Komljenovic. who authored the research together with Ben Williamson, as Haldis mentioned. Yanya is a senior lecturer at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom. Her research focuses on the political economy of higher education, on the digitalization, datafication, and platformization of universities. And she has published internationally on higher education policy, markets, and educational technology. Yanya will present the report behind the platforms safeguarding intellectual property rights and academic freedom in higher education. This is the title. The report is launched today on the YAI website. My colleagues just shared in the chat the links to the report and the executive summaries. The report is available in English, but we have executive summaries in French and Spanish as well. And we also shared an article authored by Ben and Yanya on words of education. Let me remind you that we will take questions and comments after Yanya's presentation. Put this in the chat, and over to you, Yanya.
Great, thank you so much for having me, and indeed thanks everyone for coming. I'm really pleased to do this webinar and launch the report. I'll just start sharing my screen. Okay, Sonia, if you could nod, if you can see it. Oh, thank you so much. All right, before I begin, I should disclaim that I traveled from Canada yesterday, so I'm quite jet lagged. In case I lose words or if I ramble on, it's not intentional. Also, Ben sends his apologies as he couldn't be here with us today. And as mentioned, he co-authored this research and report with me. All right, so we are going to focus on platformization and digitalization of universities today. And digital technology has steadily expanded in the sector over the past years, which was even sped up during the COVID pandemic. So not only has digital technology expanded in itself and it became sort of core tools that we use in our everyday practices, but digital technology also became datafied, if I can use this word. So for example, virtual learning environments and learning management systems wouldn't allow only to upload and share documents, but they would also offer various datafied features, such as various kinds of analytics, including predictive analytics, recommendations, and other behavioral nudging, and lately even artificial intelligence powered features. So these digital technology tools and devices and platforms also do things quite actively. Digital technology offers quite a lot of benefits in education, but also challenges. And there's a lot to say about this. And as mentioned in the introduction, Education International in this piece of research was specifically interested in what this dynamic means for intellectual property rights of academics and for our academic freedom. So the main objective of our work here was to identify risks and challenges for higher education teachers. It's quite a big ask, so our approach was to focus on the most used proprietary platforms in the sector. It's important to keep in mind that we focus here on proprietary platforms, so universities use digital technology that they procure that is private. That's why we often, when we talk about digitalization, we also mean that it's coupled by increased privatization of the sector. So we focus on proprietary platforms that are used in everyday practices. And we grouped these platforms in 4 groups, as you can see here. So we looked at platforms that support teaching and learning, both online and on campus. Examples are learning management systems, MOOCs, or online program management platforms. The second group are platforms that support assessment, for example, plagiarism detection. The third group would be core infrastructure, including clouds, but also more general infrastructure such as Microsoft Suite. And these first three groups would be targeting universities as main customers. So universities would pay subscription fees and end users would be students and staff. Whereas the fourth group targets individuals directly. We call them here content exchange platforms. So examples might be platforms that motivate students to share study notes and other materials for studies, such as Course Hero, for example. So what we did is we took all of these, the varieties of platforms, and we studied their terms of use. These are often called terms of service, terms and conditions, and similar. So basically the conditions for their operations. And other relevant policies, privacy policies, data processing agreements, and user licenses, and similar. We then constructed and structured the main risks and challenges, and then we discussed these with our informants. So we interviewed 7 people from different countries, and we complemented this material with everything we could find that was relevant for our objective, including news, reports, other material, and so on. I should also say that to identify such overall risks that might be applicable to diversity of countries and contexts, it was necessary to stay at the macro level. So not everything we say here is relevant for every institution, every individual in every country. Contexts are quite different, and I will highlight that as I go along. But the key point really was to identify main challenges that we need to look out for as individual academics and as unions, and the new risks that are brought about by digitalization. So we organized our findings along 3 themes: content, data, and freedom. And I will now move to the first theme around academic content and intellectual property. You might have seen news like this. This was a news reported by Reuters, where a Canadian student emailed a tutor that they heard in an online class, and they then discovered that the tutor has deceased. In the second news item here, reported by Guardian, they report about the case from Australia, where a student emailed a tutor with online class to discover that the tutor has left the university. So in both cases, this was terribly surprising to students. What's going on? You know, academics are not there. But at the same time, it was also quite upsetting. So we hear of more and more cases like these where, you know, there are unexpected circumstances and new conditions. So what is happening? When we teach, we obviously produce various teaching artifacts, and they are increasingly in the digital form. By this, I don't only mean recordings of lectures, but also curriculums, test questions, syllabus, teaching notes, presentations, and so on. We have always created them, but now they are recorded, stored, and managed digitally, which enables new forms of exploitation and copying. Now, this is not only for online provision, but also for physical on-campus face-to-face provision. For example, some universities now automatically record all lectures and store videos for future use. Many of them also record and store other activities happening on campus, and all our interactions that are increasingly digitalized. The second condition is also that COVID moved education online, as previously mentioned by Haldis, which has lasting effects. Many universities now offer some sort of hybrid student experience. And we also notice an increase in number and scale of online provision. So there are more and more online students and more online programs, including in their diversity. Now, what we found was that typically digital platforms do not take intellectual property rights on teaching artifacts that are created. So this has it stays between employing universities and their academics. But there are cases where platforms do take rights over content, such as an example of Turnitin. And the high amount that the acquisition company paid for Turnitin when it was acquired in 2019 only shows just how valuable such aggregated content and teaching and learning artifacts have become. We identify 3 key risks and challenges associated with academic content and intellectual property rights. First is around potential change of practices in intellectual property rights over content. So the situation around the world is quite diverse. In some countries, it would be academics who keep intellectual property rights over what they produce in teaching. In other countries, it would be universities. In some countries, it gets even more complex, and there are different rights associated with this, including performance rights next to IP rights. But what we notice is that there are more and more attempts that even well-established practices could change as we digitalize the products and as there is more and more online mediated delivery. So in the report, we highlight the case from US. So in US, typically the academics would keep the IP rights over their lectures. But because of online provision, we see more and more attempts where universities want to take license over this. So academics have to stay vigilant and collectively organize to monitor and push back against such dynamics. The arguments listed there in this complex dynamic is often that content for online provision is not produced only by academics. Often they would cooperate with learning technologists or media production teams or project managers. So then it's very hard to determine who exactly would own the IP rights. Other times universities might partner with external companies to deliver online programs. So then they get into legal arrangements through contracts with these partners, and they're quite limited in what they can do and how they can change the provision. So it all gets very complex as these new circumstances with online provision expand. The second key risk and challenge is around the potential monetization of content. And in the report, we talk about the case from UK, where fairly recently published policy documents published by a sectorial agency in partnership with an edtech investor talks about the need for universities to diversify their income streams. And one of the new potential resources that they mention is for universities to outsource their content as an asset. So in other words, universities could rent out their teaching digital artifacts, may they be whole courses or parts of them or video lectures or whatever, to other universities, and then these other universities could pay various kinds of fees or subscription to this content. Now, obviously, this then brings questions around how does this sit with open access and democratization of knowledge dissemination. And the third sort of group of risks and challenges is around just the new practices and new demands that keep on emerging as we digitalize and as more and more platforms with different services emerge as well. So we write about a case from note sharing platforms where students are allowed to publish their notes, but often they would also publish other things produced by academics, including exam questions and things like that. Sometimes it would be universities who would follow this. We heard of examples where universities would employ people just with this as their main task, to actually search for potential IP infringements infringement and demand takedown of this content. But often academics would be left on their own. So they need to spend some time to even learn about this new phenomena, find their content. Sometimes they would even need to pay for legal support. So it does bring new labor and financial challenges and burdens, potentially even emotional distress and just well-being when you need to work with all of this. The second theme is around user data. And here I just collected some quotes from the privacy statement from Ontology. Ontology is the provider of a Blackboard learning management system, so one of the most popular learning management systems in the world. And I've done this just to remind us about the level of granularity that is collected from students and staff as we engage with different platforms. So in this case, Ontology writes that they collect data from the institution itself. This would include personal information and institutional records. They also collect data directly from individuals, which would include everything we type as information for our profiles, credentials, content, and things like that. It would include metadata, so they call here this information collected indirectly from individuals, might be our IP address, machine numbers, and things like that, but also information from third parties, including social media. And I thought this was quite interesting here, since if universities would pay subscription also for the feature of social media manager, then the platform also collects discussions on social media about that university, so that university can monitor social conversations taking place. And also store it forever. So this is quite interesting, since we do see cases where universities and other agencies in the sector, or even nationally, monitor what academics say in social media as well. So in cases where universities would procure and pay subscription for digital platforms and infrastructure, it would be the universities who are typically data controllers, and platform companies would be data processors. So in this case, universities would be the ones deciding which data is collected, for what purpose, and what happens with it. However, often universities would allow companies to use user data also for product or feature development. Universities might also partner with companies to pilot particular features. What we also notice is that data is increasingly valuable in economic terms for edtech companies, not only for product and feature development and consolidation of data if they own several companies, but also treating data as an asset increasingly. So we have examples from the CEO of learning management system Canvas talking about them having the most comprehensive database in the world about how students learn, which then allows them to develop various algorithms for interventions. Or Blackboard, when it was acquired by Ontology in 2022, news reported that this was for $3 billion. And apparently the biggest value was in the consolidated user data in the aggregated form. So it's just important to keep in mind that user data did become an economic category also in the educational technology industry. There is also a part of data that platforms control themselves, where they would be data controllers. That has to do often with the log data, so-called log data or trace data. So in quite technical terms, this is the data that is needed to deliver the service and enhance the service, but quite often can be used also for product development itself. And there is a big part of user data that is not classed as personal data. So not all countries around the world have personal data protected, but even in countries where personal data is protected, there is a whole lot of data that we produce and it's not classed as personal data. Personal data can also become non-personal if appropriately de-identified and so on. So it becomes quite a complex and messy picture of who actually controls what, and especially if we keep in mind different temporalities. So what are the key risks and challenges here? First is around the unknown futures. Okay, we have more and more acquisitions happening in the edtech sector, and the modus operandi in digital economy more broadly is that companies collect data now as much as possible and then try and find use later. It's even spelled out in policies quite explicitly that in case of any acquisitions, companies would transfer user data as well, or in case of bankruptcy, they might sell user data as assets. As an example here, you might remember when 2U acquired edX recently, which caused quite a stir because of this also meant change of the for-profit orientation and values. The second key risk and challenge is also an unknown use. So because of this logic of collect now and find use later, we don't really know what kind of digital innovations or data-fied product would be developed with our data. It could be used for various new products or features that would then come back and impact us in our everyday practices. It might be used and innovated by other companies and actors in case of acquisitions. And academics are normally not really included in discussions around this. So even though it would be us producing the data, using the products, the various analytics would then impact our own lives, but we are quite typically just offered technology that we must use in our everyday work, as well as students that they use in their studies and study lives. So it is quite complex. There's a lot of ambiguity here and a lack of transparency. And finally, the last risk and challenge in this group is around labor surveillance potential. So perhaps some of you use Microsoft Suite and perhaps some of you get these automatic emails from Microsoft once a week, Microsoft Digest, I think they're called, or Microsoft Viva. I certainly do. So it's a descriptive statistical summary of the week in terms of, where you spend your time, who you communicated with, and so on. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. It allows different levels of managers and administrators to have insights into different levels of activities. So it's just the amount of data that is there just allows quite a lot insight and potentially human research management practices. In the report, we mention a case from Netherlands where a public agency actually conducted a study and they gave advice to universities saying, please do not use this for human resource management because it can have chilling effects. But if we look at other sectors, it is increasingly happening there. I think it's even called precision human management. So we also heard ideas in other research that reports about university managers or even technology companies suggesting to managers to include data in their administration of labor quite directly. And the last theme is around academic freedom. Here is a quote from Ontologies, so basically Blackboard's terms of use. In quite many universities, not only for online delivery, but also for programs delivered on campus, learning management systems have become quite central. Okay, so we have to use them as the key kind of tools to communicate with students. And so they are quite important for the way we do things and hence for our academic freedom. And here we can see in terms of use that the platform company can change product for any reason at any time, stop providing the service and make other decisions that are quite then consequential. So academic freedom means freedom to conduct inquiry and produce and disseminate knowledge, as Haldi said in the beginning, including freedom to choose content, pedagogy, evaluation, and assessment. Yet, there's by now ample research that shows that digital technology actually structures not only the way we connect, but also the way how we design teaching and learning practices. It's limiting user choice of features and functionalities, but they are quite consequential. Platforms increasingly include recommendations and behavioral nudges. So instead of actually teachers designing and managing classes and students, it would be increasingly platforms recommending to students what to do, what to read, who to connect to, and things like that. And increasingly, we see even AI in offering automated course design. So you might have heard of AI design in Blackboard Learn Ultra that actually uses ChatGPT to automatically produce the structure of the course and quiz questions and things like that. We've also heard of cases where universities, instead of employing academic staff, would rather pay high subscription fees to academic publishers for access to digital textbooks with some sort of adaptive platforms. So automated sort of display of text and automated quiz and test questions, apparently with the reason to save money on academic labor. And the key risks and challenges here are that all of this can contribute to the decreasing professional autonomy. So if instead of teachers designing teaching and learning paths, it would then be actually digital infrastructure. The second key risk and challenge is around the potential loss also of institutional autonomy. So as I mentioned before, if universities partner with external companies, they are then also bound to operate based on these contracts that quite often limit in quite severe ways of what universities can decide to do and any changes they want to make. And all of this also means more work for universities. So not only new forms of digital labor, such as learning technologists, data specialists, new vendor managers, and so on, but also for academics and students. Not only to get new competencies to manage all of these platforms, but also more and more sort of input that is needed to train the algorithms and to use the platforms themselves. This is often happening far from the eyes and the heart of everyday practices. So academics and students are not quite aware of just how all of this operates. And we have heard about the general lack of competency and resources in the sector, as well as the university organization to manage all of this. So my time is sort of running out, but I will just conclude that this whole dynamic brings the digitalization of the sector brings complex, messy combination of technological, legal, and financial factors. So, unfortunately, instead of sort of offering magical solution here, our conclusion is that digitalization actually complicates things quite a lot, which is even further complicated by the fact that there's different governance regimes across national borders and between institutions. There are no sector-wide rules, standards, guidance, or quality assurance, and there are quite fragmented responses around institutions in the sector. So I will stop here and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Yanya. Thank you for this presentation. And thank you for spelling out so clearly these very complex issues. I think you did a really great job at explaining, and it was really impressive the amount of different platforms that you were able to review, and also highlighting the diversity of situations. No, because when someone thinks about edtech platforms, you don't necessarily think about physical lessons being recorded. So I think that's also really useful to stress, and also the way in which these issues relate to privatization in the sector through the monetization of content, of data, how new practices emerge prevailing over traditional arrangements around intellectual property, the amount and diversity of user data that is being collected and that is being processed. I think this is very insightful, and it may feel a little bit overwhelming as well, because there is so much more even in your report, I know, and so thank you. I guess one first question that I will ask you, waiting for colleagues to start putting their questions in the chat, is where do we go from here in terms of action? Because you also talked about unknown futures and unknown use. And so also from the perspective of unions, what are the recommendations that came out of your research in terms of what we can do to address some of these challenges, both at the local institutional level, but also higher up at the national and international levels?
Yes, thank you, Sonia. Also for your feedback. So in the report, we do offer some recommendations, and I agree, this all does feel quite overwhelming. It also feels there's big power asymmetry and financial asymmetry as well between, you know, the industry on the one hand and higher education on the other, especially because it seems like there is a triad of relationships between companies, universities, and academics, where universities are often big actors there as well. So on the one hand, I think that what is definitely needed is way more transparency. So universities should be more transparent in including about the contracts and agreements that they have with technology companies, but also find ways to explain things more accessibly to people. So, you know, often when we ask and inquire things, we get either complicated, long documents that no one reads or understands, or we get the answer that things are commercially sensitive and you cannot access contracts often. So I think that we should demand more transparency and better communication around this. I think it's also necessary that unions convene an ongoing sectoral debate about the impact of technology and sort of collect bottom-up evidence what is happening and bring this to the table in democratic discussions. I think it's necessary that sectoral bodies organize some sort of quality assurance in technology procurement, but also in technology impact. As I have mentioned, that does not really exist. And most importantly, because there's such diversity of national contexts, I think that further research is needed in specific pertinent points in various regions and countries, just because at such macro level we cannot cover everything and there's so many nuances. So further research is needed based on specific needs in particular countries and regions, and then knowledge shared.
Thank you. There are comments are coming in the chat. Someone is sharing the work of Wolfie Crystal about labor surveillance. You mentioned it in your presentation, the potential for labor surveillance. I was wondering if you would like to elaborate on that, whether you have come across examples of labor surveillance, or more generally, if platforms do surveil and interfere with the content that is posted by academics.
Yeah, okay. So so a few things. There was a study conducted by Utah with colleagues in 2022 where they looked at what was happening during the pandemic, and they did find cases where platforms would sort of look at what was posted there, and in case they would find inappropriate content, they would take down the posts. So there is automation of content moderation in some cases. So they would just remove content published by teachers, students, or any third-party materials that they have posted, which then can contribute, obviously, for students and staff to self-censor and limit academic freedom. So we did see cases of that. I think that that's most relevant for your question probably at this stage. And thank you to Anya for the comment about Wolfie Crystal. Maybe just to mention here about the labor surveillance that there was an important webinar that was organized by Center for Global Higher Education around AI and academic labor that talks more about the automated human resource management that people might find useful. It is published on YouTube, and I'll try and find a link and post it here as we go.
Okay, yeah, we can share that with participants also afterwards. And actually, someone, I think Ghislaine from Quebec, wrote that her union is particularly concerned about the impact of artificial intelligence on academic labor. So that's very helpful. There is a nice, funny comment about the irony of discussing this on Zoom. I don't know if you have an immediate reaction to that, but I guess for me it raises another question in terms of the extent to which terms and conditions of different platforms vary, and whether there are platforms that have better practices or offer better terms than others, and if there are alternatives.
I think a few thoughts around that. Zoom actually was in the news lately, wasn't it? In the back few months about using content and chats to train the AI algorithms so that they would be able to automatically produce notes and summaries and so on. And then there was a backlash from the user base, so they did change their intentions, but they still sort of use the data if the meeting organizer allows it. So this does touch upon what I discussed before, that the way how we interact with the platform and our user data is used for product enhancement and product development, which then impacts us and our practices on these platforms. But it is a sort of market relationship, and in this case Zoom backed off a little bit, but not completely. So but what I find in my research and colleagues' research that look at this is that technology can obviously be great, because otherwise we couldn't connect and have a webinar at all if it wasn't for such a platform. But where it does become tricky is when then platforms do want to intervene, use our data without transparency, monetize our data, but then also intervene in our cognitive and cultural practices, right? So when they say, okay, when there are behavioral nudges, when there are predictive analytics that impact people's lives, so when students are classed into being into risky category or not risky category, or even staff perhaps into who's risky or not for managing and things like that. I think there has been reports around, for example, LinkedIn having AI to sort of find people who would be leaving a company and then alerting their employers if they would pay subscription for this service, things like that. So then it becomes creepy and threatening, I think for people when you would have such datafication that is done not in the best interest of users or non-transparently, and B, really intervene in our cognitive, emotional, and work practices. And this is where it gets tricky, because it almost feels like we are in the wild, wild west, where kind of more or less everything goes and there's no proper regulation around this.
Thank you, Yania. I have two questions in Spanish, so I'm going to read them in Spanish. Tenemos una pregunta de España, de Cookie, que está preguntando si la relación con la inteligencia artificial, si tienen datos o alguna experiencia al respecto. Y tenemos una pregunta desde México. ¿Cómo podemos lograr que los derechos de propiedad intelectual de los docentes sean salvaguardados ante el uso de las plataformas digitales educativas cuando la legislación local no prevé esas disposiciones? ¿Y qué podemos hacer los sindicatos de docentes para que sean vinculatorias las recomendaciones de la Organización Internacional del Trabajo sobre el tema? two questions, very different questions for you, Yanya.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Very, very relevant question. So the second one about IP. So when we were looking at this and different arrangements in quite a lot of countries, there are actually no national sort of level regulations or sectoral level, and it then does become really a matter that has to be settled between employer, universities, and staff. So I mean, the best answer I have is indeed collective sort of action, collective activation and demands, sharing potentially experience and practices between unions from different countries, sharing expertise. So the case that I mentioned, and we mentioned in our report, and we describe there and provide references also from US, but it was a successful case of how academics activated collectively and resisted a change in practice. So I don't think I can actually see any other way how we can ensure intellectual property rights, because going one by one individually in this case won't really help anyone. And the first question around AI, I'm not really sure I got it. It was around general use of AI and platforms. Yeah.
If you have specific, I guess, examples or experiences on AI platforms operating with AI.
Yeah, so we have, so the Blackboard has launched the so-called AI design assistant, and it was being promoted as the first AI use by a large learning management system. So if the university would subscribe for this service in its Learn Ultra platform, then the academics could use large language models, and in this case powered actually by OpenAI, to automatically generate the structure of their lectures, quiz questions, photos to accompany courses and things like that. This was then promoted obviously as supporting academics. So quite often the terminology here is as if the idea is not to replace teachers, but to support teachers and make them more, well, efficiency is a tricky term. So, you know, often we're talking about institutional individual efficiency, but quite often this is being promoted as tools that would help you and make your life better, but leave the autonomy. So if we understand academic freedom as freedom to really freely have time to freely think about how we want to teach and what we want to teach, and then we're talking about automated generation and personalization of teaching through features of these platforms instead of actually teacher intervention, then I do wonder, you know, how is this academic freedom exercise? So how this, I think at the beginning you talked about human-centered technology. Now, you know, is personalized teaching through an adaptive platform delivered by algorithms human-centered? Because then, you know, it is being promoted as sort of offering personalized, very human-centered intervention. So there's also a question around what we mean when we say human-centered, and different stakeholders would have very different answers here.
Thank you, Yanya. I'll take last two questions because we are close to the end of our webinar. There is one question about data trusts that you mentioned about at university. Do you have any thought about what this could look like in practice and what could be a good form of sharing this kind of findings more broadly in the academic community, as you spoke to the need to raise awareness about how these platforms operate, and most are not really aware of these issues. And there is another question about parallels between how academic research is being published by commercial publishers that are external to higher education and how teaching is being published by online program managers who are also external to higher education, and how this relates to the whole model of higher education institutions that support these practices. And then we'll wrap up. I know it will be hard. Or you can pick one.
So the last one was about the OPMs and public and sort of universities working with this with these external partners. So the Century Tech Foundation published a wonderful study where they were actually able to look at contracts between universities and OPMs in US because they were able to access that based on their regulation. We can't do that here because we don't have access to this because of commercial sensitivity. But essentially, there's a really detailed sort of insight there, just how if universities are not careful and powerful enough when they negotiate with companies, just how bounded they can become and how limited they can get because of these then legal terms that they engage with. So, for example, they would be in long-term relationships that are more or less impossible to leave. They might be in arrangements that do not allow any changes to the content or the provision, or they might be bound by, the OPMs who decide what is being taught, how it's being taught, and things like that. The content that is then shared or published is said to be technically owned and controlled by universities, but then not really if they get such limiting arrangements. So because of these OPM contracts, I should also remind us of these changing practices that I talked about, because even in situations and in contexts where academics would retain IP rights, universities might demand license from them, just so that they can then deliver online courses with external partners based on the contract. So for whatever reason, if the academics would leave the university, the content would stay there and stay published there, even if it would technically have IP rights. So yeah, that I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Thank you, Yanya. And I know we could go over and over, and there is so much to unpack in this report. So I would strongly encourage everyone to read the report. There are many examples as well in there, so it's a good and easy read. Thank you so much, Yanya, for taking the time to be with us today and for your insightful presentation. Thank you, Haldis, and thank you to all my colleagues who made this webinar possible, who are working in the background: Gina, Isidora, Mar, Kirsty, Timo, and many more. Thank you to the interpreters who facilitated our work today. And thank you all for joining us and for contributing your insights and reflections to the discussion. Let me just close by saying that next week, on May 15th, we will launch a new EI research authored by Julian Geretsman on higher education funding across the globe. The research is conducted in the framework of our Go Public Fund Education campaign that Haldis presented earlier. And it reviews and analyzes international data concerning funding for higher education and research over the world. So if you are an EI member organization, you have received an invitation to join a webinar hosted by our Australian affiliate, the National Tertiary Education Union. The webinar will take place at 8 a.m. Central European Summer Time. And the research will be available on our website on May 15th. So stay tuned, and thank you again for joining us today. Take care. Bye.